In this video, we are going to overview the Bible and film in 10 movies. We're going to go all the way back to the very beginning of cinema and see that from film's very beginning, the Bible began to be depicted on film. We're going to trace the history of Bible and film up until today. We're going to see the different conventions and the different eras in which the Bible was particularly put on film and the kinds of films that were made in different periods and the different ways in which the Bible is depicted on film. We begin our history at the turn of the 19th century with what are called passion plays. Passion plays had a long history before film, depicting the life of Jesus in theatrical form, oftentimes in open theater settings. And so the very first Bible films were recorded passion plays. The first one that we know of, the first Bible film that we know that existed, is called the Horwitz Passion Play. An early film, what it did was largely recorded life as life was progressing. It was a way to see what was going on in a different time and place. It was not so much about crafting a narrative that could be experienced by an audience, so much as it was about transporting an audience to another time and place to get a snapshot of moving life, a motion picture of what's going on in that time and place. And so what the Horwitz Passion Play and a couple of other passion plays that were created at the time did was record those scenes of a live performance of the Horwitz Passion Play, so someone in America might experience what's going on in this play in Horwitz, Austria. What this particular play was in its film version was 42 different scenes, mostly from the Old Testament and the Gospels, with also a sprinkling of scenes of the preparations for this play in the city of Horwitz, so that people in America could see what it was like to prepare for this theatrical presentation in a different time and place. Unfortunately, this Bible film no longer exists. It was screened in several cities in America, but there is no longer footage of it. That being the case, the first Bible film that we still have, the first one that we can go back to and say this is the first existing Bible film that we have access to, is a French Bible film called The Passion of the Christ. And it was like the Horwitz Passion Play, was also a recorded passion play. In this case, it was 13 scenes exclusively from the Gospels, so there was no Old Testament material in this particular film, but it also had many conflations of the Gospels. So as Jesus movies are wont to do, it took different scenes from different Gospels and sort of smushed them together to make one life of Jesus. But it also had some expansions, and this is another thing that Jesus films are wont to do. It filled in the gaps of the life of Jesus in a couple of more minor ways than many modern Jesus films do. And also, as many films are wont to do, it was full of illusionism. So many of the scenes were set up. You saw the motion picture going to a certain place where it ended as sort of a still shot. So there was a motion to a still shot that alluded to some famous works of art, so that you saw sort of the work of art being created in motion, and then when it was finally created, the film or the scene cut away from that scene, so you sort of appreciated the allusion to that particular famous work of art. The next film in our history brings us to the 20th century. This is another French film, translated as The Exodus, from 1910. It's a silent film and it's black and white for a little bit. We're going to be in the silent film era and the black and white era. Talkies, that is films with sound, would come in the mid to late 1920s, and at around the same time we have color being introduced into film as well. What this film did was it depicted one scene from the Old Testament, so it's sort of a little bit more narrative in form. Film at this time period is moving to be more narrative driven, starting to tell stories in visual form, and that's what this film does. And the reason I include this one in particular is because it uniquely uniquely interprets the Exodus account in a way that develops sympathy for the Egyptians. That is to say, we are shown Pharaoh's son, his eldest son, as sort of a lovable young boy. We're also shown an anonymous miller and his wife and their son, both of whom, as the eldest sons of Egyptians, die in as a result of the 10th plague that then leads to the Exodus from Egypt. So the narrative progression of this film shows the first Passover, Moses celebrating Passover, the 10th plague happening, and the people leaving Egypt. But it uniquely and artistically does this interpretive move that doesn't happen quite as much in just a strict reading of the Exodus account, wherein you have sympathy for the antagonists. That's sort of an artistic interpretive move that happens because of the affordance of visualization of film, because film is a visualization of the scene, and you are choosing what to focus on by focusing on the death of these young boys and the sort of emotional effect it has on their families. You develop sympathy in an artistic interpretive way for the Egyptians. We move forward just a handful of years with our next film, Quo Vadis, which is Latin and translated mean "Where are you going?" This film also introduces us to a new phenomenon we're going to see that happens very, very often in film. This is an adaptation of a novel. So the novel by the same name is an 1895 Polish novel that's set in Rome in the year 64 CE when Nero is the emperor. And this film also introduces us to a new genre or a new category of Bible film, which is called peplum, or sword and sandal films. Peplum is the Latin word for tunic, so it's the genre is taking its name from the costuming of the films, where most of the people are dressed in tunics or toga-like things, or sword and sandals. And these are not expressly Bible on film. That is to say, they are not. This genre does not strictly retell biblical narratives or biblical stories on film. Rather, they are these sort of historical epic films wherein Christian themes, characters, ideas, and Christianity as a whole sort of makes a cameo appearance, or even in some ways sort of drives the film. So in the case of Quo Vadis, one of the protagonists, the female, is a Christian with whom a Roman soldier falls in love. And so the sort of plot of the novel and the film is sort of recounting their relationship, but Christianity plays a really, really big role in it. Another thing that this particular film introduces to us is the same film, or at least the same title of a film, in multiple different versions. So the first version was in 1913, an Italian film. A silent Italian film in black and white. And this is the film that really sort of begins the era of the biblical epic. And the biblical epic is those films with sort of everything being big and epic. Large cast, large settings, a large production value, all of that kind of stuff really begins with this film in the early 1910s. And it's continued on also in another version of it in 1924. And in fact, there are also two other versions of it subsequent to 1924, including a 1951 American film, which is sort of front and center, or sort of squarely in the golden age of the biblical epic in America, that period of the 1940s to the 1960s, when it was very common to have these big productions of Bible films. So it's squarely in the second area of the biblical epic, and it also really represents what is one of the things that's part and parcel of that genre, which is sticking American values into an epic film, into a Bible film, wherein those sort of good American patriotic values overcome the totalitarian regime. And of course, in the film, it is not, it's not the Nazis, it's not the fascists, it's not the communists, but it's the Romans, who are a sort of cipher for a different totalitarian regime. If Quo Vadis brings us into the era of the epic film, then the one film that is most celebrated when it comes to biblical epic film is Cecil DeMille's Ten Commandments. Sometimes little known outside of those who know some things about Bible films, is that there are actually two different versions of the Ten Commandments film. The one that is more celebrated is the colorized version here from 1956, but the version from 1923 was also quite celebrated and was also a major accomplishment in its own right. In the case of sort of Bible film history, Cecil DeMille looms large, not only with the Ten Commandments, but several other films, including a Jesus film that's not mentioned here called King of Kings, that was first also made in the silent era and also remade into a biblical epic in the sort of second era of the biblical epic. But when it comes to the Ten Commandments, the first version was in 1923. It was a silent film with some color sprinkled in, not a full color film, but some color sprinkled in. And what's unique about this film, as far as our history goes, is that it was actually two different stories. It depicted the story of the Exodus from the Bible, but sort of attached to that was a modern morality story that told the sort of woes of breaking the Ten Commandments. It told the story of a young man who sort of serially broke each one of the commandments and how that ended up sort of ruining his life. Notably in this film, unlike the 1956 remake, Moses is really this one-dimensional lawgiver. There's really not a lot of character development to Moses, and that really changes in the 1956 version, in which Moses develops. Moses undergoes all kinds of different things happen to him. It's really a dramatic tale of his change over the course of his life. And this version, the 1956 version, which is sort of the paragon of the biblical epic, it's the one film, when you think Bible film, most people think Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. Big sets, tons and tons of people, huge cast, big production value, special effects, all of that kind of stuff. So Cecil DeMille's Ten Commandments in both versions were huge films. The first one representing the first era of the biblical epic, in the 1956 version, a great representation of the second era of the biblical epic. There were several other biblical epic films in the second biblical epic period of the 1940s to the 1960s that I am not mentioning in this video, but the sort of last one, or the one that we might say sort of put a death to this era of the biblical epic, was George Stevens' The Greatest Story Ever Told. And this was a film from 1965, and the reason that it sort of is the closing or the death of the biblical epic is that it was a massive box office flop. When we think about when we think about Bible films, we need to be thinking in terms of the economics of film. That film is very much tied up with whether the film is successful economically or not. So in this era, when there are huge casts, there's huge production values, so there's sort of a big bet placed on this film doing really, really well at the box office. It had a $20 million budget. It needed about $35 million to break even, and only grossed $15.5 million. There are several different reasons for this being a box office flop, but one of the big ones is that it's very, very long. It's in its original version, it had an over 4-hour runtime, which sort of consecutively got cut down more and more and more to make it into a shorter, more manageable film. And like other Jesus media, other Bible media, this was The Greatest Story Ever Told was first a radio series from 1947 that was then turned into a novel that was then turned into this film. And like many other Jesus film, it largely follows the Gospel of John, which gives the extended storyline or the extended time frame of Jesus's ministry, because it is implied in the Gospel of John that Jesus's ministry is 3 years, whereas the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, imply that Jesus's ministry is just 1 year. Jesus just goes to Jerusalem one time in the Synoptics, whereas he goes to Jerusalem 3 times in the Synoptics. So the greatest story ever told largely follows the Gospel of John and sort of puts in some things from the Synoptics. And one of the interesting things about it is that it was filmed in the Southwest United States. So as part of the epic genre, it sort of has these big scenes, these large landscapes, which are really actually quite beautiful. With respect to the greatest story ever told, despite the fact that it was a box office flop, it's sort of generally considered to actually be a pretty good Bible film. It's critically reviewed well these days. It sort of recouped some of its value or some of its reputation. And part of that has to do with the scenery, the way that it is constructed, and also like many other Bible films and Bible films with big budgets, because Bible films have sort of a built-in audience of Jews and Christians. In the case of Jesus films, just Christians. There was a whole marketing campaign included with the greatest story ever told that included things like Bible study materials that were sent to churches. So the idea was then that church groups would go and see the film, and then they would have materials to use to study sort of the film version of the Bible. So you have that sort of faith connection, that spiritual connection to the authoritative scripture, mediated through the medium of film. So from the period of the mid to late 1960s, really into the mid 90s, you sort of have a hiatus of biblical epic films being created. There were still some biblical epic films created every so often, but not nearly at the rate that they were in the era of the second biblical epic. But there were still other films being produced in this time period, but they were not necessarily sort of the genre of the biblical epic. And so I get to include 2 films here insofar as they were introduced or they were published, put out in the same year, 1973, and they are both musicals. That is Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar. And these musicals are similar to one another in some ways, but they're also very different from one another in many other ways. So famously, the music is done by Andrew Lloyd Webber in Jesus Christ Superstar. Sort of, the music in both is great, but maybe the music in Jesus Christ Superstar is a little bit more celebrated. Their histories or their roots are both multimedia. They are adaptations of other media, but each one is an adaptation of different kinds of media. So in the case of Godspell, perhaps most interestingly as far as Bible adaptations that you will see, is that Godspell started as a thesis project, a master's thesis project from Carnegie Mellon, and it was a clown show project. So the clown show sort of took snippets from the Gospel of Matthew and sort of built the show around those snippets. So it was not originally a musical, but was turned into a musical that was then quite popular and then turned into the film. So you have clown show to musical to film. Whereas Jesus Christ Superstar also did not start as a musical. It started strictly as a rock opera album, so just the music without the actual musical theatrical production associated with it. So the rock opera becomes a musical, and then the musical becomes a film, and these 2 musicals just so happened to be released in the same year as one another. As far as how they are set, Godspell takes Jesus and his disciples and puts them into a modern setting. It sort of plays with Jesus and his disciples in a new place. And even in fact, the disciples are not the names of the disciples from the Gospels. That they are named differently. And even in modern productions of Godspell, you will see the names of the actors used for the disciples' characters. So if someone is named Christopher, that is their name, the actor's name, they will play Christopher in Godspell. And what they'll sort of do, as clown shows do, is they'll sort of exaggerate characteristics of themselves. With Jesus Christ Superstar, the setting is a little bit different. There is some modern things brought in to Jesus Christ Superstar, but it's also set sort of in an ancient context. And you sort of have this mixture of the ancient and the modern lines being blurred. So with the case of Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar, as to our sort of how we might categorize the relationship of Bible and film here, they are sort of Bible on film in a way, insofar as things from the Bible are put onto film, but there's also a lot of expansion, a lot of changes happening. So in a way, they're also Bible in film. When it comes to what material is used from the Bible, what material is used from the Gospels, Godspell is mostly based on the Gospel of Matthew, with some things brought in from other areas. But what Godspell does is really focuses on the parables of Jesus, and particularly the parables from Matthew. But you do get things like the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke, which is unique to that particular Gospel. Whereas Jesus Christ Superstar is more a conflation, a harmonization of all four canonical Gospels. And so as a result of sort of what they're based on and what they're attempting to do, what their focus is, what you find is that Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar have two different focuses. Godspell is really about the ministry and teaching of Jesus, and especially about retelling those parables to the modern disciples in a modern setting. Whereas Jesus Christ Superstar focuses on the passion narrative. The passion is in Godspell. Jesus' death is depicted in Godspell, but it's not a focus as it is with Jesus Christ Superstar, which focuses most of its attention on the passion narrative, on Jesus' death. While the biblical epic was on hiatus in the 1970s, it was not on hiatus from being satirized with things like Terry Jones's History of the World, Terry Jones' Monty Python's Life of Brian. Mel Brooks's History of the World also sort of does some satirization work of biblical epics. But Monty Python's Life of Brian was released in 1979, and if you were to sort of do a Family Feud style of polling 100 New Testament scholars, the top answer on the board of favorite Jesus film would likely be Monty Python's Life of Brian. And of course, Life of Brian is not actually, strictly speaking, a Jesus film. Jesus makes cameos. He shows up in the Life of Brian. But Monty Python's Life of Brian is a Brian film. It's a film about a man named Brian Cohen who is mistaken for a Messiah figure. So Brian is the central character. He's mistaken by the populace, by groups of Judeans, as the Messiah, even though he is not the Messiah. In the words of the film, he is just a very naughty boy. But Jesus, again, does show up. What Life of Brian does is it sort of satirizes many of the conventions of Jesus films. And as to category, we would categorize it probably as a peplum or a sword and sandal film, insofar as Jesus and Christianity are showing up in the film, but they are not the central subject of the film. And what is why this film is so popular amongst New Testament scholars is because of the historical work that it does. So while it's not a Jesus film, it does some really, really interesting things historically. Particularly, it depicts the diversity of Judaism in the first century context really, really well. There's a very famous scene in which Brian joins the People's Front of Judea, or it might be the Judeans People Front. I can't remember. But these are different Jewish groups who are both against the Romans, but they're sort of, they hate one another. The two Jewish groups hate one another. Though they have a shared hatred for the Romans. And you see all different kinds of Judaism sort of represented in this film, as well as different kinds of Messiah figures. So the very even plot line of the film is that Brian is mistaken as a Messiah, getting at the idea that there were multiple sort of messianic templates or multiple different ideas of what a Messiah or what multiple Messiahs might have been like in this particular context. So at the end of the day, Life of Brian, a Jesus film satire, but one that does really interesting and sophisticated historical work. We get the return of the biblical epic in a sort of new form in the late 1990s, and I would sort of pin this to DreamWorks' Prince of Egypt, which was released in 1998. And this is the first animated film that we have seen in our list, and it's going to be the only animated film that we have seen in our list, but it is, of course, not the only animated Bible film. Bible films in animated form also come in a variety of different forms, lengths, and genres. Many of them sort of released directly to audiences rather than through theaters. But The Prince of Egypt is not that. It was very much a sort of big production, a biblical epic in animated form. And its animation was a mixture of hand-drawn and CGI, which was beginning to emerge really in the early 1990s and starting to come into its own, beginning in the late 90s and the early 2000s. You think of films like The Matrix. In a way, The Prince of Egypt is sort of in that era of CGI really coming into its own. It also has a wonderful music and a soundtrack, so it's not strictly speaking a musical, but as an animated film, it has a whole lot of music in it, with singers like Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston providing tracks. So big names as to the soundtrack, big names as to the casting of the film. And so it's sort of the return of the biblical epic in a new way. And it's also the return of the epic and sort of have some connections to Cecil DeMille's The Ten Commandments, insofar as it is very much a coming of age story of Moses, as much as it is a retelling of the Exodus event. So you have both the Exodus being retold, but also Moses' sort of coming of age, coming into his own as a person and as a character, being one of the things that really drives the plot forward. And in that way, it very much mirrors Cecil DeMille's 1956 The Ten Commandments. One of the ways that this is sort of successful, it was successful sort of as an entertaining film with its big cast, with its great soundtrack, but historically speaking, it was also pretty successful in sort of what it did. The characters are not whitewashed. You don't see sort of the othering of the Egyptians. It's not as though the Hebrews are sort of one group that are clearly sort of whitewashed and the Egyptians are made other or sort of made foreign in some way. Rather, the Egyptians and the Israelites or Hebrews in this film are the same skin tone, and that skin tone is not white. That these are people of color. These are brown persons depicted in the film. And the other ways that this was successful is the film was not expressly Christianized. In the era of the biblical epic, even when it came to Old Testament epics, there was sort of Christianity infused into those Old Testament epics in a really palpable way, and in a way that, if you watch them now, can be off-putting, especially to Jews. The Prince of Egypt was not that. It celebrated faith sort of in different forms, so that Judaism is celebrated, and Jews can very much enjoy this film and sort of find themselves in this film, but Christians can as well, insofar as Jews and Christians share the scripture of Exodus. And the sort of result of all of these factors, its historical sensitivities, but also its epicness, and executing the epic genre well, meant that it was a major box office success, and in some ways that inspired the return of the biblical epic in a new form. So beginning in the 2000s and in the 2010s, we start to see Bible epics sort of returning and using a lot of the same playbook of The Prince of Egypt, with modern CGI, big casting, these kinds of things. The Prince of Egypt returning us to what we might even call a third era of the biblical epic on film. Perhaps the best known biblical epic of this third era, what we might call a third era, is Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, which sort of has a love-hate relationship. So The Passion of the Christ was released in 2004. It is technically speaking a foreign language film, insofar as the language of the characters, what the characters speak, is Aramaic and Latin. There is a bit of criticism of having characters speak Latin, because we know that the lingua franca, the common language, would have been Greek at the time. Nonetheless, it's a foreign language film in Aramaic and Latin, though with English subtitles. So an American film in foreign language with English and English subtitles and other subtitles, of course, for other languages as well. This film was particularly popular with audiences and less popular with film critics. And it was particularly popular with Catholic and evangelical audiences who would take church groups to go see this film and sort of then debrief it afterward in a sort of spiritual, emotional experience. This was true of sort of church groups writ large, but also of youth groups. And this despite the fact that the film was rated R. And the reason that the film is rated R is because of its sort of its violence, and some would critique it as being gratuitously violent. One of the things the film does well, and one of the things the film aims to do, is to depict the horror of crucifixion, the horror of crucifixion as a form of capital punishment. Nonetheless, the film is sort of accused of indulging in that violence, of being essentially 3 hours of violence. The other main sort of accusation against this film is that there's sort of no way around it. There is anti-Semitism in it. That Jewish figures are depicted in anti-Semitic ways. In one case, Jewish children literally turn into demons. And when Mel Gibson was confronted about this, rather than sort of hedging or making changes, he sort of doubled down on it and presented it as a way that he himself was being persecuted for making this film. So accusations of both indulgent violence and anti-Semitism in this film, which is one of the reasons that film critics have not received it particularly well. As far as the content of The Passion of the Christ goes, it's not necessarily sort of based on any one gospel, and it's not retelling a gospel. It's really focused, as its title implies, on Jesus's death, the Passion of the Christ, and particularly, rather than being based on the sort of written medium of the Gospels, it's really largely draws its narrative or its progression from the Stations of the Cross, and from sort of explications of the Stations of the Cross, from one particular mystic theologian from the 19th or early 20th century. So rather than being based on the Gospels themselves, it's based on sort of a theological medium and depicts Jesus's crucifixion in the last 12 hours of his life. The last film that we're going to engage is not, in fact, a film, though some of its seasons or some of its episodes have been released in theaters. It is The Chosen, which began in 2017 and is still ongoing today, at the time of this recording anyway. But we're going to start not with some of those details about what it is, but we're going to start with some of the ways that it has been successful, the reason that it is so massively popular. And I think, to my mind, the main reason that The Chosen is so popular is that it provides a depth of character for the disciples and for Jesus. One of the notorious problems of Jesus films, one of the difficulties of making a Jesus film, is really the Jesus story is not all that interesting. There's no romantic interest. There's no real character development because Jesus doesn't have any moral flaws. So Jesus is really a flat character when it comes to the Gospels who doesn't develop. What The Chosen does by sort of adding in material, by building backstories and building, we might even say, side stories for the disciples and for Jesus, it's really able to give Jesus and the disciples personality. And this is done masterfully in the acting. The actors actors do a fantastic job portraying Jesus and the disciples and making them interesting characters, making their relationships with one another very, very interesting. So I think the success of The Chosen largely has to do with that character depth. It's able to do something uniquely because of the time and space of being a television series rather than a film. The Chosen also does have a sort of evangelical bent, though it does have some Christian ecumenical input into the writing and the production. Like many other Jesus films, Bible study materials are available for doing sort of church studies with The Chosen. And a way historically that The Chosen is successful is like the Prince of Egypt. The characters are not whitewashed. Jesus is not blue-eyed, blonde-haired. And neither are all of the characters. That they are not a cast of a bunch of white dudes. So there is some sort of cultural and ethnic sensitivity to how the characters are portrayed. As to some of the details about The Chosen, so as I indicated, it began its release in 2017 as a crowd-funded series. And because it has multiple different seasons, the intention, as I understand it, is to do 7 seasons of this show. The producers and the writers are able to make this multiple season story arc where the characters get a significant amount of development throughout the course of the 7 seasons of the series. Interestingly, and we're going to end here, as to the sort of multimedia nature of The Chosen, as we've seen, Bible films very often allude to and remediate or represent different forms of biblical media. In the case of The Chosen, you have a sort of opposite direction. You do have the Bible turned television. That is to say, The Chosen is depicting the life of Jesus and is using all 4 canonical Gospels, harmonizing them to make the story of Jesus while also giving back and side stories. But with The Chosen, you also get a sort of movement back to the written version. So Dallas Jenkins, the director's father, Jerry B. Jenkins, has turned seasons of The Chosen back into written forms, back into novels. So you have this interesting move where the written versions of the Gospels are made into the visual form, the visual media of television, and then returned back into the written form of novels. So you get this sort of circularity to the writtenness of the media when it comes to The Chosen.